our speakers about Canadian Lutheran World Relief and celebrating its great 75 years. I'm going to start off with the land acknowledgement. I acknowledge this land traditionally inhabited by the Huron-Wendat and the Anishinaabe people, whose presence here continues to this day. The closest Indigenous community is the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. May we live together with respect and goodwill. And I'm going to turn it over to Petra to open with a devotion.
Petra, you'll have to unmute yourself. I just going forward.
Okay. I chose a poem which was published in the Era, our local newspaper, earlier in November, and it's from Brian Sankar Singh. It just touched me, and that's why I chose it. And I've read it to the members of the Global Justice Team once before, I guess on the day when it came out. The poem goes like this. Welcome to Canada, said the man at immigration, as tears flow freely from my eyes. No more covering in darkness, fearful of violence, my children now free to enjoy all that life has to offer without watching over their shoulder or covering in constant fear. Welcome to Canada. Hello, freedom. Seldom have I tasted such sweetness, to go and come as I please without terror or fright or dread. Rid those fears from my head. In this true north, strong and free, I'm beginning to feel I could succeed. Hesitatingly, I think, may I can dream again, without caution or vigilance or fright. Stepping from darkness into the light, welcome to Canada, said the man at immigration. Does he really understand the meaning of those words? That was the poem from Brian Sankar Singh.
Thank you, Petra. So for this evening, we have two speakers. We have Marg Nauman and John Constable from Canadian Lutheran World Relief. He is speaking to us from Winnipeg. And they will each do a presentation, but after each person speaks, so after Marg speaks, then there'll be time for questions and comments. And then we'll go on to have John's presentation, and he can have time for questions and comments. So I'm going to begin with a description, a biography of Marg. Marg has lived with her husband and family in Newmarket since 1975. She was a stay-at-home mom until her 3 children went to school. Soon after, she started work as a medical secretary for several doctors in Newmarket. She has been on the executive of the Visual and Performing Arts Newmarket for the last 20 years. Marg and family joined Holy Cross Lutheran soon after it was started, and she is a member of the Global Justice Team. So we look forward to your presentation to hear your story, Marg.
I would like to start with the short family history. Originally, my ancestors of my mother's family lived in a small town called Leonberg in southern Germany. In the early 1800s, word was spreading through Germany that Catherine the Great was offering free land in Poland to thrifty farmers that could cultivate the land. My ancestors journeyed to an area just west of Warsaw where a village had been created for them. They called this village Leonberg, the same name as the town they had left. Leonberg grew quickly with many large families coming. My great-grandmother, born in the mid-1800s, was a good example. She gave birth to 21 children, with only 13 growing to maturity. When my great-grandmother celebrated her 90th birthday in Poland, she prided herself in having 79 grandchildren and 109 great-grandchildren. The focal point in Leonberg was a Brethren church similar to the Moravian Brethren. This was loosely affiliated with the Lutheran Church. The 1920s were lean years for this community and for almost all of Poland. In the early 1920s, Canada and South America were opening their doors to immigrants. My mother's two brothers came to Canada and settled in Kitchener in 1929. They later served as sponsors for many of us. It's important to note that the established Leonberg community maintained its German heritage and language during all of this time in Poland. When World War II broke out, Poland was caught between Germany and Russia and punished severely by both sides. My father, along with most of the men in the area, were conscripted to serve in the army. Towards the end of the war, Leonberg was at great risk as Russian troops advanced into Poland. The German inhabitants were desperate to flee back to Germany. One evening, my mother was told that a train was leaving at 5 a.m. the next morning. She took me, I was 2 at the time, my sister who was 4, and my brother 6, and what little she could carry. She managed to get across the border into Germany, while some of her relatives were unfortunately turned back. The Brethren church leaders at that time were actively trying to deal with the influx of refugees. With their help, we were directed to a farm in northern Germany, where we stayed for over a year. Although the government pressured the farm family to help, they were good to us and we became friends. But the church leaders realized that more was needed. They approached the German government and were given property near the Dutch border. This land had previously been a German prisoner of war camp for Russians. Neugnadenfeld, or translated New Grace Field, was created. It consisted of barracks on a barren peat bog. The barracks were soon divided into dwellings. A post office and school were set up, and of course a church, which once again served as the focal point of the community. We lived here for almost 2 years before we were able to come to Canada. Regular parcels came, many from my Uncle John in Canada. As young children, we had some choice words, which won't be repeated here, to describe those parcels that didn't have any candy or treats in them. It was in 1946 that Lutheran church leaders gathered in Ottawa to discuss the pressing challenge of the millions of people displaced by World War II. Canadian Lutheran World Relief was established at that time. In conjunction with Lutheran World Relief, a US organization, clothing, bedding, and food was sent. Arrangements were made by Canadian Lutheran World Relief to bring displaced people to Canada. It is important here that Horace Erdman, a Lutheran minister from Kitchener, was instrumental in this process, and he came to the Lutheran World Relief Office in Germany. In 1948, my family boarded the Beaver Brae to come to Canada. The women and men were housed in separate areas. My mother, unfortunately, was seasick for most of the 14 days on the ship. She certainly wouldn't have appreciated the games my sister and I played by climbing up and down the bunk beds. My other memories here are few and far between, but I do remember the dishes and cutlery crashing to the floor when the seas were rough. It was also during this trip that I had my first orange. It's still the best orange I've ever had. Unlike Pier 21, where our other relatives had arrived, the Beaver Brae docked in Quebec City. We made our way to Kitchener and were greeted by relieved and welcoming relatives. For us, it was like coming to the promised land. This is a picture of the Beaver Brae, the boat. And between 1948 and 1954, the Beaver Brae brought approximately 33,000 refugees to Canada. It made a round trip every 28 days, carrying 775 passengers each time. This is a picture of the barracks at the Russian prisoner of war camp, or the German camp. And it as you can probably even see there, that there's little sections with windows, and that where the divisions were for the people. This barren bog, which I talked about, here are women even working hard to cut them into bricks, and they were dried and used for fuel. And this is a picture of Neugnadensfeld, or New Gracefield, the way it looks now, and for the last few years already, of course. And it's just beautiful compared to, of course, what it was. I should have just added that Neugnadensfeld is also celebrating their 75th year at this time. That's a complete picture of the beaver brae. Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Marg. Now, do people have some questions that they have for Marg? Comments?
Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Marg. Now, do people have some questions that they have for Marg? Comments about this? I found it a very touching story, Marg. Yes, Petra.
I have a question. Do you know how your parents registered for that passage, or did they have to wait, or like how that process happened?
That was arranged through Lutheran World Relief, Canadian Lutheran World Relief. But my uncle in Canada, he was in touch with them, and he sponsored us as well.
Okay.
So when we got here, he had a place for us to live, and my dad started working almost immediately.
Hi, Marg. I just wondered what your you talked about the bunk beds on the ship, but what were the sleeping and living quarters like? And was there more than one family in each unit, or how was it arranged?
I can't remember that. I guess there must have been some divisions, but probably not. I think there were just bunk beds and places for people to sleep,
Okay.
and there must have been, and then there was a dining room, I guess, where we ate.
Okay.
But I can't really remember.
750 is a lot of people to be, in a
Yeah.
central,
Well, it was-
like a communal
guess
space.
It was a pretty big boat, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, Marg, can you recall very much about the train? Was it a train trip that you would have done from Quebec City to Kitchener?
No, I don't remember. I just know we got there safe, and everybody was happy to see us, and we were happy to see them.
Yes.
I had my grandmother here and my two aunts, and they each had two girls. And we were lucky because my second uncle Herman, he went to St. Peter's Lutheran Church, and so did my other uncle. And he ended up marrying the organist there, because I think he had a beautiful tenor voice and probably sang solos.
So so sorry.
So I'll just say one. And Marg, you've told me that his wife was Canadian and she could speak
Yes.
English.
She was our only Canadian aunt, and she really helped us get registered to school, to a doctor, to a dentist, and all those kind of things that we weren't prepared for.
Marg,
Yeah.
I'm assuming your family wasn't able to bring a whole lot with you to Canada. Do you remember what sort of items might have been in your luggage?
I can remember a few things that my mother actually brought from Poland. And my sister still has it, like a knife and fork and spoon and a little pot. What we brought from Germany, I think, would have just been our clothing. I don't think we were able to bring much more than that, but I can't remember.
I think you showed us at one time like a basket or trunk.
Oh, a trunk. Well, that's right. We had actually two woven trunks, and I have one of them and my niece has the other one. So yeah, that's right. They would have been filled with whatever we could bring.
Go ahead, Petra.
So your uncles, did they come on the beaver break as well, like earlier, or how did they come?
No, they must have come on a different boat. The Beaver Braid didn't bring them.
But
They came in,
they
they
flew
came
out
in
of Poland as
1929.
well.
Pardon?
They came from Poland as well.
I have no idea how they managed that. I can't even visualize the connection between this little village in Poland and getting to Canada. I can't imagine how that happened.
Marg, I have a question. As a refugee yourself, how do you feel when you see the endless reports on the news of refugees fleeing?
Well, I feel for them. And they, well, in many cases, they're really have experienced a lot more violence and that kind of thing than we did. We just, except for during the war, of course, everybody was hurting, but other than that, it wasn't some of the violence that you see with these refugees. And they're walking so many places, you know, like when they're trying to cross borders and stuff like that. I don't think we had any of that kind of experience. Of course, Lutheran World Relief really helped in that sense.
And the Lutheran connections that you mentioned too, Marg, the brethren.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a very faithful community. As I said, that was the focal point. And the other thing I'll mention is in that congregation, and I think today it's still the same, they don't have piano or organ, it's all brass band. And so most of the people learn to play an instrument. And it's interesting. It's a very simple church building that they have no ornamentation hardly at all. It's quite white and benches. The little church in Poland, my mom and my sister and I went to Poland, quite a few years ago now. And the church that they had in Poland is still there. Now it's a Catholic church, but it's well kept up, but they still have straight benches with no backs. And that's how it was when my mom was there. She was really thrilled to be able to see this church.
Well, thank you, Marg.
You're welcome.
Anybody else have anything that they wanted to comment or question to Marg?
Oh, I just thought of one other thing. The peat bog, that now is a really thriving business for peat moss. It's exported all over the place, I guess, in Germany or wherever. But that's what their livelihood is a lot.
Margaret, you said that your father and I guess your uncles as well were conscripted during the war. I wondered, like, what were they conscripted into? Into the German army, the Polish army, the Russian army? I'm curious.
It was the German army.
It was the German, because my grandfather is also from the same area, and he was conscripted into the Prussian army.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, they were in the, although I did have an uncle and a cousin. The cousin is my oldest cousin. He's 93 now. He and his father were both taken to Siberia.
Oh, wow.
And they never thought they would get back, but they did. And they actually thought that the father would get back because he was older, obviously. And they didn't think the young fellow would get back, but they both did somehow. I don't know.
And how did you and your mother and your family survive when your dad was off fighting?
Well, we actually, my dad had worked in a factory and they provided lodgings for us. So we actually had an apartment that we lived in an apartment building, not in the same little village anymore. We had moved on from there where I was born.
Okay.
And the train station is still there that we left from, although it's not used anymore.
Interesting.
It's kind of dark up in the room that she's placed me in here so that I'm out of the way. One thing, and this is maybe a male perspective, that's quite a sanitized version because of the horrors of what happened to the little village as it was bypassed over and whatever. Some of her relatives died of starvation, some were whatever. So there was a lot of war drama in between. The only other thing, a little bit of humor, Marg has a cousin, Willie, who has a very droll sense of humor. And in high school in Kitchener, the teacher was saying there were scholarships for children of veterans. And Willie said, well, does it depend which side they fought on? So he didn't qualify. That's all.
Yeah, that may have changed, Neil. I would hope now, yes. Well, thank you very much, Marg, and thank you for everybody's questions. And I'll introduce now John Constable from Canadian Lutheran World Relief, speaking to us from Winnipeg. John has over 13 years of experience in fundraising, covering individual giving, grant applications, membership, legacies, and corporate partnerships. He has worked in both the university and charity sectors, with a particular focus on business and management education, aeronautics, and environmental conservation. John arrived in Canada in December 2019 and joined Canadian Lutheran World Relief in February 2020. He has managed fundraising appeals covering a range of different projects across the world. As Director of Community and Donor Relations, he is responsible for developing Canadian Lutheran World Relief's fundraising and donor stewardship strategies to grow revenue and deepen relationships with donors in order to fund the organization's vital humanitarian work. So welcome, John. I'm looking forward to hearing about maybe current refugee program sponsorship and also other programs.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. I should start by thanking Marg for her presentation, because I think her story is a testament to the legacy of CLWR, and I think it talks about it much better than I could, so I think we're very grateful for sharing that story with us. It's a story I've heard actually quite a lot in the last year as we celebrated our 75th anniversary, because we've spoken to lots of people who came over on the Beaver Bray or whose family did. So it's been quite an education actually this last year in hearing those stories and what people went through. I will start, let me just share my screen. Okay, yeah, so I'll just give a little background first on the organization and our department. So I work for the community relations department. So with the split function that we have is that, as Sharon mentioned, we do the fundraising for appeals. We also do various church outreach that we'd like to also kind of increase this year now. And we also cover the marketing, so we're the sort of the mouthpiece for the organization. Our previous director was Carla Blakely, who some of you probably know. She left last week. She received a calling, so she's going back to her roots, I guess. So we're sad to see her go, but obviously very pleased for her that she's making that step, and we wish her well, and we'll keep in touch with her. We, as a department, we work closely with two other departments in the organisation, which will sort of form the base of this presentation. The first is the Refugee Resettlement, who are based in two locations. We have one in BC and another one over in Ontario in Kitchener. So they handle various applications for refugee settlement. And the other department that we work closely with is programs, which are predominantly based in Winnipeg. And they oversee the humanitarian projects across the world that we do, and work with various partners on those. So I will cover those things sort of in the second half of this presentation. But for the first part, I want to talk about the refugee resettlement aspect of it. And as I said a moment ago, it's really the core, it's the essence of what created CLWR and what we were first really about. And we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for refugee resettlement and the efforts made by people to bring people to Canada safely. There's one particular story I want to share with you, which will, I think, it's the most recent success story of refugee resettlement. I think one which gives it kind of really, it covers everything about what we do and gives you a good insight into the value of it. But first, I want to give you a bit of background as to the situation that we're facing. So these are estimates, of course, but it's estimated that 80 million people are displaced worldwide. Nearly 46 million of them are IDPs, which means internally displaced people. So people who are within countries who have to move to other parts of that country for various reasons. So you might often hear them be called sort of refugees, but the correct term is internally displaced peoples. We have 26 million who are refugees and 4 million are asylum seekers. So for this year, nearly 1.5 million refugees are expected to have been in need of resettlement. So it's quite a number. And of course, the reasons for the need for resettlement varies, everything from conflicts to famine. Climate change now is becoming a big factor in that as well, forcing people to move, especially in areas where they're so heavily reliant on agriculture, and the effect that climate change is having on that has forced people to has displaced them and has created that need there as well. So the story I'll tell you is about a church called Bethany Lutheran Church in Woodstock. They have done this a couple of times before, but this particular story is their third resettlement experience, but it's their first during COVID, which of course had quite an impact really on the process. Obtaining various paperwork like social insurances and tax credits was more challenging. With the children that we'll talk about in the story, they entered school after the quarantine had ended. So I guess they fell a bit behind than perhaps they would have done if they were able to do that before COVID. And the other obstacle was high increase in rent. And I'm sure it's same across Canada. I can speak for this in Winnipeg. The cost of living has gone up quite significantly in the last year, which of course impacts upon the capacities that we have to resettle people and what's required to get them set up, get them sort of started in their new lives in Canada. And because of COVID and the restrictions of travel and everything, the family's arrival here kept being postponed. So frustration and anxiety was quite high. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a story from their own words about what they went through and what they've experienced. I'll put it on the screen as well, but I'll read it out. So this is the story from Debbie, who's the mother of the family, with her husband and their 3 children. Sorry, let me just go to the previous one. Okay, so we fled Myanmar 10 years ago. The government and military is very bad and violent. Things are even worse for the Chin state. They don't like us because Chin state wants freedom. When we first arrived in Malaysia, we lived in one room. We were paid 1,000 ringgit, which is about 300 Canadian dollars, to work in property restoration, whereas a Malaysian doing the same job would get paid 3,000 ringgit. If you are off one day, they cut 2 days' salary. The corruption is very bad in Malaysia. Police are always arresting foreigners and locking them up until someone can pay 1,000 ringgit to set them free. It's dangerous to live there and medical expenses are very high. Our children cannot go to government school and were not given Malaysian birth certificates, even though they were born there. We prayed and prayed to be able to leave. In 2019, the Malaysian government wanted to send back all the refugee Chin people. Because our children were born in Malaysia, they would not be allowed to study in Chin state. Thankfully, we were able to find a sponsor in Canada. The UNHCR helped us to extend our expiry date on our visa, and the IOM made sure we were healthy. Just before we were to leave, IOM said that one of the family tested positive for COVID. We kept receiving mixed results. We had to quarantine for 1 month, but tests were false positive. Once we were on our way, there are many people who helped us. The children didn't sleep the entire way from Dubai to Toronto because we have never been on a plane before, but we were so excited. We feel very confident and safe in Canada. We're very happy that our children can go to school. People are helping us so much. So I think what that story does is give an illustration really of how many people have to pull together to make these things happen, and the logistics involved in these kind of things. But I'm sure you agree that the results are worth it. It's worth putting the effort into help find people like this family a new home, to help escape hardship, persecutions, all the troubles that might face in different parts of the world. So despite all these challenges, they now have a place to call home. They're eager to improve their English and find jobs, raise their children. And this church that did it was a very small group, but worked and was very committed to improve their lives. So just an overview really then of what sponsorships involve, or what the two types. You can have what we call full sponsorships, where maybe a congregation provide the financial support and settlement support needed, and then family linked ones, whereby a family in Canada might provide part of that financial support, or maybe a combination working with a congregation. So they'll name the refugee they want to settle, and then constituents groups, as we call them, which is usually Lutheran congregations, and co-sponsors will share the responsibilities of helping those people come over to Canada and be settled. Sometimes the financial support might be provided by relatives as well. And obviously in the case of this family, that wasn't possible because they didn't have anyone here. So the constituent group, the church, was the one that took the full sort of responsibility of helping with that. So responsibilities pre and post arrival. Sorry, it's quite a text heavy slide, this one, but just to kind of summarize really, it's when a congregation wants to do this and they set up a committee of volunteers to do that, they have to think about how they're going to communicate with the refugees, the fundraising for it, housing, health, education, helping them settle in the community. Of course, translations, interpretations also important in many cases too, helping them complete the paperwork, providing not just startup funds to get them started, but sometimes ongoing monthly support as well, helping them find housing, so your bills, utilities, your furnishings, all those kind of things. If they have children, the applications for schools, registrations, healthcare, and ultimately what we are trying to do, what's important is that we are giving these people the tools and resources so they can become independent and self-sufficient and make lives for themselves here. I think that's the most important aspect of this, and something that is the end goal. And things to consider for anyone who's thinking of doing this is that just the importance of the budgeting, and also I guess the cultural sensitivity, knowing about where these people are coming from, what's unique about where they're from and their culture, I think is probably the most valuable thing in all of this, because it's not a one-size-fits-all process. It's different each time for each person. Each person has a different story to tell, right? So that's something we always have to be mindful of as well. But it's it was a great story to have. I think it's the most recent one that we've settled. We are trying to do. People have been asking us a lot about Afghanistan, but often in the case with that, we're having to sort of take the lead from other government and other organisations as to what's permitted and when we can act, and processes take time, which is always frustrating and saddening, because again, the example of Afghanistan, the need is now. The need for resettling for people is right now, but unfortunately, it's there's a process that we have to go through, and we try our best to do that as quickly and as efficiently as possible. The other thing I just want to talk about as well, in terms of what CLWR is about, is the work that we do around the world. So I mentioned earlier that we work with our programs department, who carry out this work. And these form the basis of our fundraising appeals. So you might see these come through your letterboxes a few times a year, maybe 5 times a year, usually around sort of Lent, summer, Advent appeals we do one in fall as well. And we are also looking forward really to see how we can do more in terms of tailoring these appeals and these asks for churches to become involved, because sometimes churches and congregations will do it sort of like to do collective giving. They like to pull their resources together and try and support appeals. But just some of the examples of what we've done this year. So in Lent, we raise money for food security and sanitation for South Sudanese refugees who were arriving in Canada, sort of generating regular income from their support for their families, providing purchasing tools and all this kind of thing to try and help them become I guess, build lives of themselves as refugees as they're arriving in Uganda. Then in the spring, you may remember the news about the government coup in Myanmar. We raised money to build longhouses for internally displaced people in that country. I think the target was to build 29 longhouses, which we estimated would house over 230 families who were, fleeing the troubles there. And that was a successful appeal as well. In the summer, we helped people in Burundi who had once fled Burundi because of violence, and they're now returning to Burundi, but they were struggling to rebuild their lives. Because land had been taken, they couldn't access the resources they once had, which was a particular problem for those who were in agriculture, because then suddenly their productivity was low, which meant in turn led to a food crisis in Burundi because of the low productivity. So the appeal there was to raise money to provide food for families, just to keep them, keep them sustained, keep them going whilst they resettled and sort of found their feet, having returned home. In the fall, we did an appeal for El Salvador. The situation there is that El Salvador suffers from extreme weather events, namely floods and droughts, almost like a cycle of these. And each time that happens, crops are lost quite considerably. So we wanted to raise money to provide them with farmers there with a type of insurance, which had meant that when these events occurred and they lost their crops, they would be compensated. Otherwise, the situation is that when they lose their crops, they can't pay back loans that they've taken for those crops. They then have to sell their assets and they give up farming. And if farmers give up farming in a country like El Salvador, suddenly you see a food crisis developing. So that was quite an important appeal that we did a few months ago. And then this Advent appeal is focused on Venezuela, where we are helping the situation there is that the public health care is kind of taken it's already struggled anyway, but the effects of COVID have really meant that the capacity of places like hospitals there is very, very low, and people can't get the health care they need. So we've identified a clinic in Caracas that we can sort of boost its capacity and resource through these difficult times, so that people can get the various treatments they need and don't have to rely on the very expensive private healthcare options that are that they're forced to find in that country. So those are sort of, I guess, a summary of all our appeals that we do, and the way in which people can help, either through church and congregations, so giving through collections, which is a great way to have a collective impact. And so we do receive lots of checks throughout the year from church congregations and church groups, and also, of course, by individual giving. So if people give as individuals, then we can thank people personally and report directly on the impact of their gift, and they can do it by calling, email, visit the website, and there's all different means of doing it as well. So those are the ways in which people support our appeals. We're very, very grateful in any kind of support that we can get, and like I said earlier, we're going to try and see how we can sort of, I guess, form our appeals around more tailored towards church groups and sort of mobilizing people that way, so they can give collectively and join together, and an opportunity, I guess, to learn about the work that we're doing in these different parts of the world as well. So yeah, that's hopefully given you a good summary of the two aspects of our work, and really why, like I said at the beginning, we're so dependent and so grateful for the support we received, because we couldn't do any of these things if it wasn't for Lutherans across Canada helping us do that and supporting us in that way.
I have a question. So well, thank you so much. It's probably hard to tell what CLWR is doing in just 20 minutes, if you even use 20 minutes. In the beginning, you talked about sponsorships, and you gave that example of that family. How much money is involved to bring a family, let's say, of 4 or 5, of 4 or 5 members into Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, a family of let's say, take these for an example, if we say a couple with 3 children, their basic needs allowance is usually around, I think this is per month, so I think it's $494. And then that's sort of the initial thing. That includes, so that's the basic needs. Shelters usually around, we call shelters, so accommodations are usually around $800. Transportation as well. When you throw everything in, it's usually, it can amount to anything really, depends on where they're coming from, but anything between 2,000 and 18,000. It's a range really in terms of what the costs are. But I'll certainly say that it depends really on just the length of the process, where they're staying as well, of course, is a big thing, and how many of them there are. But I think a family of 2 adults and 3 children, you're looking at sort of around 15,000, I think, for the whole process.
For the whole process, but that only includes them getting here, and then you still have to support them.
Yeah. So, right.
Like,
Yes. So yeah, the basic needs would be around sort of, I say for $500 a month to help cope with things like the cost of accommodation, and then what we call a housing supplement of $200 as well, and transportation, if they need that to get to work and their jobs and things. So it's usually around sort of, that's between around $700 a month really, to kind of as a supplement to help them as well. That's from our side of things, not to mention any sort of grants they might get from local government or federal.
Thanks. Neil?
Neil's hand is up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry.
Unmute.
That was great. I got my hand up fast and forgot I had one.
Sorry, Neil. It was you.
John, what kind of process does Canadian Lutheran World Relief use to choose what they're going to help? Is it you've got partners throughout the world that you relate to, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because this is a process I have to go through with every time an appeal comes around. We have to see what's happening in the world and what we can do to help. And so sometimes of the year, there could be lots going on that we have to kind of pick one thing, and sometimes there's probably not much happening. So I guess the process, the criteria goes through really is how active are our partners at that particular time and what they're doing. I think sometimes, say with the case of Myanmar, that was a big thing in the news, right? So it was almost like you feel like that's an obvious thing to do, because people are asking questions, what's your response in Myanmar? As with our emergency appeals as well, often where we choose to do our work is driven by donors and Lutherans calling us to ask. So, recent things with, say, the floods in BC, we did an emergency appeal for that because we had so many calls of people asking us, what's your response going to be in BC? So we did an appeal for that. But generally for these appeals and the countries I mentioned, we have our fingers on the pulse because of our active work with various partners around the world. And then we have meetings with those people to say, what's happening, where can we help at that particular time. So timing is a big factor, I guess, really in these things. But yeah, it's really just consultation with partners, consultation with the people who are doing the work on the ground, and in some cases, our donors asking for a response somewhere, which is a great thing as well. It's great to have that drive from people to say, we want to see action, we want to see CLWR take the lead on something. I don't remember, another example would be last year, if you recall the explosion that happened in Beirut. And what happened there is the Humanitarian Coalition, which is a big organization of different humanitarian charities that we are part of, then decides really that there's going to be a response. and then it kind of filters through there. So we get sort of we take our lead from that coalition, and they'll say, okay, this is something that we're going to do, and the humanitarian coalition will I guess look upwards at the government to try and get something like a match funding scheme going, and then the individual organizations will then sort of reach out to donors to get support for that as well. So yeah, it's a range of different things, different criteria that would drive it. But I'd say usually, yeah, it's just knowing the work we're doing and responding to our audience really, and to our stakeholders.
Neil,
Yes, Neil, go ahead.
unmute.
Sorry, Neil, I had to mute you. Your sound is got some static there. So if you could unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Now, I hope this is a positive setup question. Nowadays, people are very careful because there's so many charities, and we look at ratings. If I'm right, Canadian Lutheran World Relief rates pretty well as a charity. I'm flipping that over to you. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is, there's different organizations that do it, and their rating criteria varies. I'd say the reason we do well, and I'd say the reason for that would be, firstly, that we are very efficient in how we use the money that we raise. So our administration costs are very low. I think it's something like, is it 3%? So when you take a donation, and in order to get that money to the project it needs to go, there has to be some administration to get that money there and to get it into the hands of the partners and to the people. By administration, we don't mean things like overheads of staff or anything like that. Those all come from grants. When people donate money, it's all basically put towards that project, and our administration is getting the money to that project. I think that's one of the reasons why we rate so highly. I think another reason we rate well with those agencies is because we're very transparent. We publish an annual report every year that details our expenditure, where it's going, how we're raising the money, and from whom as well. And I think transparency is always going to be a very important factor in not just in terms of those kind of accreditations, but I think just in terms of our donor relations, it builds trust. I think my experience of working here in the last nearly 2 years is that I feel that our donors have a huge amount of trust in what we do, which is great. And I think that's partly because they feel a sense of ownership of CLWR. You know, it's their charity. We are just the means through which Lutherans can help people across the world. You know, so I think that kind of dynamic lends itself well to make us more accountable to donors and make sure that we are, our transparency is sort of at the best it can be.
Thank you.
John, when it comes to the appeal to be able to help in British Columbia, in the Lower Mainland and Merritt and those areas, the decision was to go ahead to have donations there. Are you partnering? What organizations do you partner with?
So the partner, it's usually sort of like local charities. I can't name them specifically, but it's usually local organizations who are sort of delivering the aid there to people. So there's too many really to mention. I think I personally don't deal with them directly. Our programs team will, but it's usually local charities and organizations. So for example, there's one there that will be providing sort of accommodation for people there, for example. So that's one that we'll partner with them. We'll make sure that we don't send the money directly to them, but the money is collected in a kind of general emergency fund and then distributed to the partners as they need it, really. And it's actually not just money. I think some of you may recall we used to have a shipment program, WeCare, where we used to collect quilts and things to send abroad, which we had to close, unfortunately, because of the effects of COVID on the logistics of it. But we're still in our warehouse in Winnipeg, have some quilts left over. So we're looking at actually seeing if we can distribute those as well to some of our partners there, and the various sort of charities that deal with, in BC, that deal with homelessness. We could perhaps, send our quilts there to help people. So yeah, it's just a range of things. We just collect the money into an emergency fund. And then we go through the various, the sort of the procedures, the legal procedures about how to distribute that to where it needs to go.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I've been to the warehouse in Winnipeg.
No, yeah.
And helped out with some of the kits one morning when I was.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to see. Yes.
With
yes,
Cody, was it?
Yes, with Cody. Yes.
Yeah, because so Cody now he works with me on the donor relations side of things as well.
Oh, good for him. Good.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions from any of the people that are here this evening? Yes, Sharon.
John, you mentioned that the funding for salaries and so on comes from grants. Who are the grants from?
Government grants, to some extent, yeah. They come from sort of government grants. There is I can't remember. There's a commission that is set up to sort of help fund charities, basically, to enable them to do this, so that we don't have to pay ourselves, because we have a number of staff. We don't want to be paying that from donations. I think that's actually something we always try and stress, because I think it's not something that we've suffered, but I think generally sometimes charities do face the accusation of using donations to pay for overheads, and we don't do that at all. We use things like grants, and I think also not necessarily huge endowments, but there are some small endowments that have been placed as well that generate some income. In the past, nowadays not so much because interest rates are much lower, but we do have a kind of a well, as it were, to sort of support that as well. But it's either charities. I'm sorry, it's either government grants or I guess you could call sort of I don't know what you'd call the term here. In the UK, we call them quangos, like quasi-autonomous, non-governmental things. So things that are kind of maybe channeled through the government, not necessarily part of the government, but whose role is to provide grants and things to charities and institutions and things like that. And of course, we being a charity, we have some tax exemptions as well that we can benefit from that will help fund our work in that sense as well.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
We're nearing 8 o'clock, but go ahead if there's anybody else who has any questions, and we'll be finishing fairly soon, so we're not going for a lot longer. Seeing nobody with their hands up, I asked Petra to be able to offer a gratitude to the presenters this evening, Petra.
Yes. So in the name of our global justice team at Holy Cross Lutheran Church, and if you can raise your hand so that John can see who's in that team. So you see quite a few of us are here.
Yeah.
I'm thanking you both from the bottom of my heart to take the time tonight and share your stories and information with us. And Marg, so proud to call you a friend and member of Global Justice to share your family story. It's incredible, I think when I look at the screen, at least half of us are immigrants, out of different reasons or with different backgrounds. But to be not just an immigrant, a migrant is a different story again. So thank you so much for having the courage to talk about your family history. And John, thank you. I feel inspired and challenged, and I hope that we all can respond to the needs out there. So thank you so much for taking the time and joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
And I just want to be able to add and a wish that we can remember that it's Christmas, and we can remember CLRW in our giving. The Congregation of Holy Cross has supported Canadian Lutheran World Relief over the years, including many years of enjoyment in assembling and sending learning and hygiene We Care kits. In 2017, for Reformation 500 years celebrations, we raised funds for scholarships for Palestinian students, and we planted many trees in Canada. Here is the catalog for the We Care gifts this Christmas. And you can also get the same thing online at CLWR.org to look at the gifts that you could give to someone on your Christmas list. And please think of Canadian Lutheran World Relief for meaningful and impactful gifts this Christmas. Thank you, Pastor Dawn.
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Yes, thank you very much to everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you very much to John and to Mark. And I'm really happy that so many people would join us and learn about CLWR and help in celebrating, because this is coming toward the end of their year of celebration of 75 years of great humanitarian work. So thank you.